He left me standing at the airport curb in the snow suitcase by my feet without so much as a text. And when I finally reached him, his words cut deeper than silence. "It's just the airport, not a funeral." That was the moment something inside me shifted. This is not a story of anger, but of awakening, of a mother who gave everything and finally decided to give herself the one thing she'd never been offered: peace. Stay with me. Because what came next changed everything. I used to say yes before the question was even finished. Yes, I can cover that field trip. Yes, you can have the new sneakers. Yes, I'll pick up a third shift. Yes, I'll figure it out. That's what mothers do, isn't it? Especially when there's no one else coming. My name is Elaine Monroe. I turned 67 this past fall. I live alone now in the same pale yellow house in Vermont where I raised my son Kyle. It still creaks the way it did when he used to run through the hallway with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, shouting something about Pokemon cards and muddy shoes. That house has seen everything. First steps, fevers, final words. And I've stayed because I don't know how to leave a place that still feels like him. Kyle was 10 when his father died. A car accident on a rainy Tuesday. No last words, no preparation. Just silence. I remember standing in the hospital hallway holding Kyle's small hand and realizing I had to become both parents overnight. So I did. I picked up extra shifts at the community clinic, working late into the evenings, and sometimes sleeping in the on-call room because it was closer than home. I skipped lunches so Kyle could have field trip money. I missed weddings and birthdays, my own included, so he wouldn't feel the absence of what we'd lost. I never remarried. Not because I didn't have the chance, but because every time someone asked, my answer was already spoken. Kyle comes first. People called it devotion. I just called it motherhood. When Kyle got into a private college, I cried. Not because of the tuition bill, though it nearly knocked the air from my lungs, but because he'd made it. I drained half my retirement savings that year and didn't blink twice. When he said he wanted to start a tech business in LA, I co-signed the loan. When that failed, I helped him move into a cheaper apartment and paid down his credit card debt quietly. Then he met Leah, sweet on the outside, polished to perfection. They married quickly, too quickly maybe, but Kyle seemed happy, and I held on to that like it was a warm coat in winter. They settled in California, and I told myself the distance was fine. Planes exist for a reason. Except over time the visits became fewer, the calls shorter, holidays skipped. One Christmas, I sat in front of the fireplace with the turkey still warm and untouched, staring at the unopened gift I'd wrapped for Kyle. He'd texted an hour before dinner saying they were just too busy this year, but sent hugs. Still, I held on to the hope that maybe things would shift. That one day he'd look at me not as a reliable fallback, but as a person, a mother who had given everything she had, and then some. That's why when Kyle invited me to visit last winter, after nearly a year and a half of barely hearing his voice, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. He didn't offer much detail, just, "You should come see us." Mom, followed by a plane ticket forwarded to my inbox. My hands trembled a little when I saw it. Maybe it meant something. Maybe it meant I still mattered. I packed carefully. Not just clothes, but the little things he used to love. A box of molasses cookies, the kind he used to sneak 2 at a time. A faded photo of him with his dad fishing in Lake Champlain. A scarf I knitted in his high school colors. I didn't sleep much the night before. I kept picturing the moment I'd walk through the gate at LAX and see him waiting with a silly cardboard sign that said, "Elaine Monroe, VIP Mom." I imagined him grinning, maybe even hugging me tight and whispering, "I've missed you." The flight itself was uneventful. Some mild turbulence over the Rockies, a crying baby 2 rows back, and a cup of lukewarm tea that did little to calm my nerves. I kept glancing out the window, watching the clouds pass like slow-moving regrets. When the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign turned off, I reached instinctively for my phone. No new messages. But still I smiled. He must be circling the terminal, I told myself. Maybe he's waiting with flowers. Maybe he's nervous too. The airport buzzed with strangers. Families reuniting, kids squealing, lovers embracing. I stood near the baggage claim, then moved outside to the pickup zone with my small suitcase rolling behind me. The sun was high, but the wind carried a strange chill. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 45. No Kyle. I called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Then came the text. Just 7 words. Can't make it. Just grab an Uber. Then another seconds later. It's just the airport, not a funeral. That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a hollow sentence that fell into the pit of my stomach like a stone. I stood there for another minute. Maybe 2. Then I opened the Uber app, gave it my son's home address, though by now it felt foreign, and climbed into the back seat. The driver didn't say much, neither did I. My suitcase sat upright beside me like a second spine, rigid and quiet. Out the window, palm trees waved like they were mocking me. The sun didn't feel warm anymore, and somewhere between the curb and that car door, something inside me shifted. Not rage, not even sorrow, just weight, a gravity I hadn't noticed before. And I started to wonder, if it wasn't a funeral, why did it feel like something had died? The back seat of the Uber was warm, but my fingers wouldn't stop trembling. I didn't tell the driver why I was so quiet. I didn't need to. He barely glanced at me through the rearview mirror, probably assuming I was just another tired tourist. I stared out the window as we pulled away from the airport terminal. People came and went with purpose. They had somewhere to be, someone waiting. I had Kyle's address typed into the app, but no one waiting. Not really. The traffic was slow. LA always moved like it had somewhere better to be. Billboards flashed past new shows, smiling faces, grand openings. My eyes blurred over the images. I wasn't sad. Not yet. I was something else. Something harder to name. The driver asked, "You want me to take the freeway or surface roads?" I blinked. Whichever's faster, I said, though I didn't really care. He nodded and turned up the radio. Some pop song I didn't recognize filled the silence. The beat thudded against my ribs, but it didn't feel alive. Kyle's message kept echoing in my head. It's just the airport, not a funeral. 7 words. I read them again in my mind as if they might mean something different the second time. They didn't. I used to pick him up from airports. I used to stand at baggage claim with a hot cocoa in hand, scanning the crowd for his messy hair and slouched shoulders. Once, when he came home for fall break his freshman year, he had a duffel bag full of dirty laundry and forgot to say hello before handing it to me. I laughed back then. I thought it was funny. Funny how much we let slide when we still believe love is enough. The Uber turned onto a quiet street lined with trees that didn't belong in December. Bougainvillea spilled over fences like gossip too bright, too loud. California always felt a little surreal to me. Sunshine and winter palm trees dressed for Christmas. Kyle's house came into view. White stucco, modern, soulless. I recognized it from the pictures. Leah had posted photos on social media last summer, new beginnings she'd written. There was a photo of Kyle holding a set of keys, grinning like a lottery winner. I wasn't in that photo. I wasn't in any of them. The car rolled to a stop. I looked at the door, then back down at my hands. The driver glanced over his shoulder. "We're here." I nodded. "Thank you." I stepped out, my knees stiffer than I remembered. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and concrete. My suitcase wobbled as I pulled it up the driveway. I rang the bell. Nothing. I rang again. Still nothing. I reached into my bag, checked my phone. No new messages. I tapped out a quick text. "Just arrived. At your door." And sent it before I could overthink it. A minute passed. Then another. Still silence. I walked around the side of the house, found a shady spot on the porch bench, and sat down. The bench was cold through my coat. That was when it hit me. It wasn't just the airport. It wasn't just this visit. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small withdrawals, missed calls, forgotten holidays, requests sent without gratitude, promises broken so casually I stopped noticing the sound of them snapping. I used to believe in holding space for people to grow, but what if they just keep walking further away? Kyle wasn't coming. He wasn't busy. He wasn't stuck in traffic. He had simply chosen not to be there. And not just today. For a long, long time. I stood slowly and made my way back to the curb, calling another ride. The second Uber arrived within 5 minutes. A different car, a different silence. "Back to the airport?" the driver asked. I shook my head. No, just a hotel nearby. I hadn't booked one in advance. I'd hoped. I wouldn't need to. I found a small hotel with beige walls and soft lighting. The woman at the front desk was kind, called me ma'am, and asked if I needed help with my bags. I declined. The room was quiet. Too quiet. I unpacked nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my coat, and stared at the floral print curtains. I should have cried. I thought I would, but there were no tears, only stillness. I picked up my phone again, stared at Kyle's last message, the one about funerals. I wanted to respond. Not to argue, just to ask, "Do you even see me anymore?" But I didn't write anything. I just closed the screen and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. In the dim glow of the lamp, I looked at the old photo I'd brought, the one of Kyle and his father at Lake Champlain. Kyle was 8, his cheeks round and sun-warmed. He'd been holding a tiny fish with both hands beaming. Back then, he couldn't wait to show me everything. Every scraped knee, every school drawing, every stupid joke. Somewhere along the line, I became the background noise to his success, and now I was just someone who didn't need picking up. I slipped the photo back into my bag, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the lights of the city blinked like distant stars. Beautiful. Unreachable. And I whispered to myself, not in bitterness, but in realization, it wasn't a funeral. But something did end today. Not my love, not my dignity. Just the illusion that I still mattered to him in the way I once did. The house was warm when I returned, but it didn't feel like mine. Snow was falling in soft sheets, layering the porch, the hedges, the familiar welcome mat that now felt ironic. Welcome, it read. But all I felt was distance. I rolled my suitcase through the door and let it rest in the entryway. I didn't bother unpacking. I wasn't sure I would not yet. Everything inside felt too heavy for drawers, too personal for closets. I took off my coat and hung it in the same hallway closet where Kyle's first backpack still lived, half buried beneath forgotten scarves. I used to press my face to that bag after he moved out, breathing in what little trace of him remained. It didn't smell like him anymore, just dust and fabric softener. In the kitchen, I turned on the kettle out of habit. The sound filled the silence, but it didn't comfort me. The windows still wore the garland I'd hung 2 weeks earlier. I'd decorated like he was coming, even though I'd known deep down he wouldn't. I'd baked gingerbread cookies and left the second chair at the table pulled out just in case. I sat down and opened the tin. Still soft, still untouched. On the wall above me hung the photo I always stopped to look at. Kyle in 2nd grade, missing one front tooth, holding up a lopsided papier-mâché turkey. He'd been so proud. His cheeks were flushed from running around the playground, and I'd caught that photo just as he turned to show me. Back then, he couldn't wait to share things with me. Now I had to chase down proof that he even remembered I existed. I stood and walked to the living room where the shelves held the remnants of our life together. Snow globes from our one trip to Colorado, a drawing of our old dog. Bailey cards Kyle made when he was too young to spell Mom correctly. I ran my fingers across the edge of one card, now brittle with age. "I love you, Mommy. I'm happy when you smile. I used to smile so much more." before I learned that giving everything doesn't mean they'll give anything back. I sat down at the dining table, opened my laptop, and logged into my bank account. The numbers were familiar. So were the transactions. Uber charges from California, a streaming service I didn't use, a grocery delivery order that included oat milk and organic protein bars, nothing I'd ever buy. Kyle's name was still listed as an authorized user on 3 of my cards. I'd added him years ago when he moved out, just in case. But just in case had become just expected, and expected had become taken for granted. I clicked through the tabs, staring at the quiet leak of my own security. Monthly payments, interest charges, little cuts I hadn't felt until now. I used to tell myself it was no big deal. What's $30 here, $50 there? That's what moms do, right? We soften the blows, cover the gaps, keep things afloat. But now, for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never dared to face. Why? Why did I keep paying for someone who wouldn't pick me up from an airport? Why did I keep showing up for someone who didn't even bother to say, "Sorry, Mom, I forgot"? Was it love? Maybe once. But now I wondered if it was fear. The fear that if I stopped giving, I'd have nothing left, no one left. That if I drew a line, the silence on the other side would be permanent. But hadn't it already been silent? When was the last time Kyle called just to check on me, not to ask for help? When was the last time he remembered my birthday without a nudge from Facebook? I remembered last year when I'd made a big pot of chili for my own birthday dinner. I'd sat at the table alone, 2 candles flickering, and a message came through at 9:42 p.m. "Hey, Mom, hope today was good. Been swamped. Love ya. No call, no gift, not even an emoji." And I had responded, "Of course, sweetheart. Take care." Because that's what I always did. Covered for him. Made it easy to forget me. I closed my banking app and stared at the cursor blinking in the browser bar. It felt like it was waiting for something. So was I. I moved the mouse, hovered over Manage Access. I didn't click. Not yet. But I sat there longer than I ever had before, just thinking. Not about him, but about me. When was the last time I asked what I needed? What would it feel like to stop bleeding slowly for someone who doesn't even notice the red? I stood, poured the boiling water over a tea bag, and watched the steam rise in quiet spirals. Maybe nothing had changed. Or maybe everything had. Because for the first time, I didn't feel guilty for wondering what it would be like to choose myself. The morning light filtered through the blinds in narrow, gold-tinted stripes. It fell across the kitchen table like a quiet invitation. I stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, holding my old ceramic mug, steam curling gently from the top. It was the same morning routine I'd done for years. Boil the water, brew the coffee, sit, breathe, check the bank accounts. Except today, something was different. Today I wasn't checking to make sure Kyle's payments had gone through. I wasn't transferring money. I wasn't smoothing over overdraft notices or moving dates around to cover shortfalls. Today I was here for me. I sat at the table and opened my laptop. My fingers moved with steady rhythm, click, click, login. The interface was familiar down to the blue activity tab, and the small photo of me in the corner, smiling, trusting. I clicked over to the account settings. There it was, Kyle Monroe listed as a secondary user on 2 checking accounts and 1 savings, still holding a joint credit card, still on the emergency access list, still treated by the system and by me as someone who deserved to be there. But he wasn't. Not anymore. I clicked the first account. Remove authorized user. It asked with a polite prompt, like it needed to be sure. Like it couldn't imagine someone would want to take that step. I didn't hesitate. Yes. The screen blinked. Done. I moved to the next. Click. Confirm. Done. One by one, I peeled back the digital permissions that had tied us together. Each one felt like taking back a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The credit card was last. He'd used it last week. A restaurant in West Hollywood. $92. The charge cleared without so much as a thank you. I stared at it for a moment. Then I froze the card. A pop-up appeared. This action will suspend all linked activity. Yes, that's the point. I sat back in the chair and exhaled slowly the way I used to after helping a patient through a long shift. Back when I was still a nurse, we had a saying, slow is smooth and smooth is strong. No need for drama, no need for noise, just precision and resolve. I closed the laptop and walked down the hallway to my study where I kept my personal files. Medical directives, property forms, power of attorney. The drawer creaked open with the weight of years. I took out the folder marked, "In case of emergency." Kyle's name was everywhere, written in my own neat handwriting, black ink, chosen without question. I had made him my emergency contact when he turned 22. Sad. It was supposed to mean something, that I trusted him that he would show up. He didn't. Not when I had gallbladder surgery 2 years ago, not when I fell on the icy front steps last February and bruised my ribs, not even when the doctor called to say they'd found something on the scan. I handled it all alone. Kyle had been traveling for work. I stared at the line that said, "Primary Medical Proxy." Then I crossed it out. I replaced it with Rosie's name, my oldest friend, the woman who brought me soup after my surgery, who drove me home from the ER when I couldn't walk straight, who called every Sunday whether I answered or not. Rosie didn't have a title in my life, but she showed up. I moved on to the living will, changed the beneficiary. No longer Kyle. Instead, I divided the estate, half to a local women's shelter, half to a senior legal aid foundation. Groups that actually understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and used. I updated the legal contact. Changed the emergency phone number, rewrote every document until the pages no longer felt like they belonged to someone else's priorities. For the first time in decades, every line had my name at the center. Not as a parent, not as a provider, just as a person. I placed the folder back into the drawer and closed it gently. No slamming, no punctuation. I didn't text Kyle to let him know. I didn't send an email or write a speech in my head explaining my decision. Because it wasn't a punishment. It wasn't spite. It was survival. It was a mother recognizing that her life had become a series of financial favors and emotional absences, stitched together by hope that had stopped being returned. And now, I had simply stopped stitching. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee. The house was quiet, but the silence didn't hurt today. It didn't echo. It felt earned. I sat at the window and looked out at the snow-covered yard. The trees were bare, the garden asleep. But beneath the frozen surface, things were still alive. Sometimes what looks like the end is just a long pause before something new begins. I took a sip, closed my eyes, and whispered aloud. Not to Kyle, not to anyone listening, but just to myself. You did the right thing, not because it was easy, but because it was time. The first message came in just after lunch. I was folding towels by the window, the winter sun streaming in pale and cold across the floorboards. "Mom, my card's not working." "Can you check?" That was all it said. No hello, no punctuation. No sense that I might be in the middle of my own day. I stared at the screen for a second, not surprised but still a little hollowed out. I didn't answer. I just set the phone down on the counter and kept folding. 2 minutes later it buzzed again. I'm at the gas station. It declined twice. This is super annoying. Still no warmth. Still no please. Just the usual sense of expectation. Like I was a help desk, not a mother. I picked up the phone, looked at the screen again. His name still sat at the top of the thread, Kyle Monroe. Underneath it, the words, "Read 1:17 p.m. glowed in gray. I didn't reply. I turned the phone face down and walked away. My hands shook a little, not from fear, not from guilt, from something quieter, something closer to clarity. I'd spent decades jumping every time he needed something, whether it was money advice, paperwork, or just someone to vent to. I used to answer within seconds. It didn't matter where I was or what I was doing. Kyle came first, but not this time. This time I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. I waited for the water to boil, standing barefoot on the cold tile, arms crossed. When it clicked off, I poured the water into a chipped blue mug dropped in a tea bag and carried it to the table. Then I sat, slowly, deliberately. The phone buzzed a third time. Mom, 3 question marks. Not concern, just impatience. I reached for the drawer and pulled out my journal, the one Rosie gave me for my birthday. It still smelled faintly of cedar from the shelf I kept it on. The cover was worn now from weeks of flipping it open and closing it without writing anything. But today I had words. My pen hovered for a second, then moved. I was never the emergency in his life. Maybe it's time he stopped being the emergency in mine. I stared at that sentence for a long time. A nurse's instinct dies hard. We're trained to respond, to rush in, fix things, stay calm in the chaos. And as a mother, that instinct deepened into something even more permanent, something almost reflexive. But I wasn't a nurse anymore, and I wasn't just a mother. I was a woman who'd finally reached the end of a very long rope. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in enough. I sat there, tea cooling in front of me, and let my mind drift back to 2 years ago. The gallbladder surgery. I had told Kyle about it in advance, texted the appointment details, reminded him the night before. He had said, yeah, I'll be there. Don't worry. I had packed an extra pillow just in case he offered to drive me home. I even brought his favorite mints in my bag, like that would somehow make it easier for him to stay by my side. I remember waking up in the hospital room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. I was groggy and sore, the IV beeping at a slow, steady rhythm. I looked toward the hallway, expecting to see him there. Nothing. An hour passed, then 2. The nurse finally came in and asked gently, "Do you want us to call someone for you?" I nodded, too embarrassed to speak. I went home alone the next morning. The cab ride felt longer than the surgery. Later that day, I got a text. "Sorry, Mom, work blew up. Hope you're okay." That was it. No call, no visit, no offer to bring groceries or help with prescriptions. Just a flat sentence, like it was a scheduling conflict. Like I had been moved to the bottom of the list. And still I didn't say anything. I told myself to be understanding. I replied, "It's okay. Hope work gets better." But something inside me never quite healed from that. It wasn't just his absence. It was what that absence said. I wasn't a priority. I was a placeholder. I was the safety net that didn't require checking. And now 2 years later, the same pattern repeated. Except this time I wasn't waiting in a hospital bed. I was just done waiting. I opened the phone again just to clear the notifications. 3 messages sat there stacked like accusations. I deleted them all without reading further. Then I opened my journal and kept writing. Maybe he never meant to hurt me. But it doesn't matter. Hurt is hurt whether it's loud or quiet. And mine has been quiet for too long. I paused, then underlined that line too. The phone stayed silent the rest of the afternoon. I turned it off. I lit a candle in the living room. Not for any reason. Just because I wanted to. I made myself a warm bowl of lentil soup, read 2 chapters of a book I'd forgotten I owned, and wrapped myself in the old quilt my mother sewed when I left for nursing school. Outside, snow had started again, soft and slow, the kind that makes you feel like time is folding in on itself. And in that stillness, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. Not Kyle's texts, not his explanations, not even the version of myself that used to be afraid to disappoint him. Because the truth was, I had been disappearing one sacrifice at a time. Now, I was starting to return to myself. I closed my journal with a soft snap, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like someone's mother. I felt like Elaine again. It began with a single post, just a photo of a wine glass half full on a marble table. The caption read, "Some people forget who was always there for them. Sad how money changes hearts." I wasn't tagged, but I didn't need to be. The lighting was carefully chosen. Golden hour soft. The message even softer, at least on the surface. But every word landed with surgical precision. I knew Leah's tone, the way she wrapped resentment in silk. Within an hour, the comments piled up like snow against a front door. "Thinking of you, Leah. You don't deserve this. Hope she realizes what she's doing before it's too late. Elder abuse is real. Stay strong." I sat in my living room, the soft hum of the radiator rising and falling beside me, and watched the screen glow with opinions from strangers who had never once asked for my side of the story. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. But something in my chest went still, like a lake freezing beneath its surface. I didn't comment. I didn't even scroll too far. I just took a screenshot, then another, and another. I created a new folder in my photo library documentation, public statements. I labeled each one with the date and time and added notes if necessary. Not out of spite, out of practice. For 28 years I was a nurse. We documented everything. Not because we were suspicious, but because when someone's life was on the line, details mattered. Facts mattered. And now, my own peace of mind was the patient. The next post came 2 days later. Leah again. A selfie this time, no makeup, eyes slightly red. One hand holding Kyle's across a dinner table. The caption read, "It's hard when the people who raised you start pushing you away. But healing takes time." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was crafted so carefully, like a press release dressed as vulnerability. I'd spent years trying to connect with her. Sending birthday cards offering to help when they moved, even baking her favorite lemon squares when she came to visit, though she barely touched them. Leah was always polite, always smiling, but never warm. She once told me gently that she didn't like being called sweetheart, said it made her feel small. I stopped. I never said it again, but apparently I hadn't earned the same restraint. I saved that post too. And all the comments that followed. The hardest part wasn't the lies. It was the quiet. The absence of anyone who knew me stepping in to say, "That doesn't sound like Elaine." People I'd once shared potlucks and prayer circles with were clicking heart reactions and writing things like, "Hope justice is served." No one called. No one asked. It reminded me of something Clara once told me over lunch. She had just taken her first big case and was giddy with conviction. The truth doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs a record. Let the liars talk. They'll furnish your entire case. And so I let them. I watched them construct their version of the story brick by brick with hashtags and moody filters and curated heartbreak. And I stayed silent. Not because I didn't care, but because I was done explaining my worth to people who preferred performance over presence. The truth is, I used to think silence was weakness. That not defending yourself meant surrender. But now, I understood something deeper. Silence, when chosen, is a form of power. It makes space for clarity, for memory, for strategy. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, poring over the same screenshots for the third time, and suddenly realizing that I no longer felt angry. I felt aware. I saw how far they were willing to go to make me small, and I saw just as clearly how far I'd already come to reclaim myself. Rosie stopped by that week holding a paper bag with 2 muffins, and her usual look of someone who already knew the answer to the question she hadn't asked yet. "You see the latest?" she asked, sliding her phone across the table. I glanced at the post. A shot of Kyle standing by a snow-dusted tree, hands in his pockets. The caption beneath it, "Even when you do everything right, some people will still leave." I nodded. I saw, "You gonna say anything?" "No." "You gonna strike back?" I smiled. Not bitter, just tired. Not yet. Rosie leaned back in her chair and exhaled, sipping her coffee. "They don't know who they're messing with." "They don't need to," I said. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to finish. That night I lit a candle and opened my journal again. I didn't write much. Just one line etched in slow, careful strokes. Power doesn't come from proving them wrong. It comes from knowing you don't have to. I closed the cover, blew out the flame, and let the silence wrap around me. Not like a cage, but like a blanket. Because for the first time in a long, long while, I didn't need to be understood. I just needed to be free. The envelope arrived in silence. No knock at the door, no signature required. Just a thin white rectangle slid under the threshold like a ghost slipping into my house. I found it while heading to the kitchen, barefoot, morning robe still loosely tied. I bent down, picked it up, and knew before I even opened it that something had shifted. My name was printed in black ink on the front. Sharp. Official. Inside, a summons. Court date set for the following Friday. Plaintiffs: Kyle Monroe and Leah Monroe. I read their names again and again as if they might fade with repetition. They didn't. The allegations were bold, ridiculous even. Claims that I was no longer mentally competent to manage my own finances, that I was being influenced, manipulated by external parties, that I was mismanaging assets and needed protective oversight. Protective oversight. That phrase did something to me. It cracked open an old ache I didn't even know still lived inside me. After everything I'd given, the decades of showing up, of putting them first, of saying yes when I wanted to scream no, they had the audacity to say I needed supervision. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so cold. But I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I picked up the phone and called Clara. She picked up on the first ring. I figured this might be coming, she said, her voice calm, like this was just another procedural cleanup. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. You still have the folder I gave you? Every page, she replied. We'll walk in ready. 1 week later, I stood in front of the county courthouse. It was an old building, one I'd passed 100 times without ever imagining I'd enter for something like this. The bricks were faded, chipped at the corners, like they'd seen too much over the years, and stopped pretending to be impressive. I was dressed simply. A slate gray pantsuit, soft pearl earrings, and low heels that made no sound on the marble floors. My hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. No makeup, just a light dusting of powder and clear balm on my lips. I wasn't here to be seen. I was here to be heard. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, but colder. Sterile. A space built for facts, not feelings. Kyle was already seated on the left side of the room. His suit looked expensive, but ill-fitting, like a child playing dress-up in a man's closet. Leah sat beside him in a tan turtleneck and oversized coat, whispering intently into the ear of a young lawyer who looked barely older than her. They didn't look at me. I didn't expect them to. Clara met me at the front bench. She gave a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet confirmation. We're okay. When the judge entered the room, Rose, she was a woman in her 60s, stern and deliberate, with silver hair pulled into a tight twist. Her voice was steady when she called the case Andrews versus Andrews. Plaintiffs may proceed. Kyle's lawyer stood first. He began with the tone of someone trying very hard to sound compassionate. He used words like concern, confusion, decline. He painted me as a woman slipping quietly and without realizing it. A woman being taken advantage of by unnamed others. A woman who needed protection. Not once did he refer to me as a mother, just as the defendant. Then Clara rose. She didn't perform. She presented. This case is not about concern, she said, placing a folder gently on the table. It's about control. She flipped open the folder and began. Exhibit A, text messages. Time-stamped, casual, frequent. Kyle asking for money just to tide me over, just for rent, just until the app launches. Some messages were barely a day apart. Exhibit B, credit card charges tied to my accounts. High-end restaurants, ride shares, streaming services, even a hotel in Santa Barbara. All with no prior approval. All during times I was sitting alone at home in Vermont. Exhibit C, a voicemail from 6 months prior. Kyle's voice laughing slightly, saying to someone, "Likely Leah. She's starting to lose it. Once we get control of her stuff, we're basically set for life." The room didn't gasp. It stilled. Even the young attorney stopped flipping through his notes. Then Clara looked to me. "Would you like to speak?" I stood slowly. My knees didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. "I raised my son alone," I said. "I fed him first, paid his tuition, covered his dreams. I skipped my own retirement to help him build something he walked away from. And I never complained. Not once. Because that's what mothers do. But I never, not once, gave him permission to treat me like a bank with a heartbeat." Silence. Heavy, weighted, respectful. The judge adjusted her glasses, looked at Kyle, then at Leah. Neither of them spoke. The ruling came quickly. All claims are dismissed. The defendant is found fully competent, fully independent. The plaintiffs are fined for filing a frivolous suit and attempting to exploit the court for personal gain. I didn't smile. I didn't turn to look at Kyle. I simply gathered my things, nodded once at the judge, and walked out. Outside, the air was cold and sharp. The sun had slipped out from behind the courthouse roof, casting long shadows across the steps. Each one I descended felt lighter than the last. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like I'd been unhooked from something. Like a patient whose oxygen tube had finally been removed. Not because she didn't need air, but because she could finally breathe on her own. Rosie was waiting by the curb. She held a paper cup of coffee and a small smile. "No confetti?" I asked, stepping beside her. She shook her head. "You hate cleanup." We laughed. Quiet, soft, like women who had lived long enough to know that peace doesn't need applause. And as I took that first sip, I realized I hadn't won today. I'd returned to myself. I woke before the sun. There was no sound in the house. No pipes creaking, no wind brushing against the windows, no soft hum from the fridge. Just stillness. That rare kind of stillness that doesn't ask for anything. I sat up in bed and let the quiet settle into my bones. It was the morning after the courthouse. But it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like the start of something I had waited too long to name. I wrapped my robe around me, slid my feet into the slippers Rosie had given me last Christmas, and walked to the kitchen. The floors were cool, but not cold. Familiar. The kettle clicked as it warmed, and I watched the steam rise like it always did. But this time I wasn't just making coffee. I was making space. Space for myself. For a future that didn't have to be negotiated, explained, or shared. I sat at the table with my mug between my palms, breathing in the bitter scent. Then I opened my laptop. The banking portal loaded slowly like it was catching up to me. My username autofilled. My password was still the same. It had always included Kyle's birth date. I changed it. Then I opened the trust account I'd started months ago but never activated. It had sat dormant like a secret I wasn't ready to say aloud. Until now, I reviewed every section, line by line, account by account. My name appeared at the top of each one, but so did something else. Old permissions, legacy settings, shared histories I hadn't quite severed. Today, I clicked edit. One by one, I removed secondary users. I unlinked old automatic transfers. I disabled joint access. I reviewed beneficiaries. All of them were gone now. No successors, no proxies, no names etched beside mine as placeholders for expectation. Then I reached the final line. Transfer all assets into sole ownership trust. The Elaine Monroe Trust. Trustee. Elaine Monroe. No beneficiaries, no successor trustee, no codicils. I hovered over the confirm button. Then I clicked. The screen blinked, processed, and returned a simple message. Changes complete. It felt quiet. Too quiet for how monumental it was. But I didn't need trumpets or tears. Just this, a clear ledger and a clean name. I sat back in the chair and looked around the kitchen. Everything was the same. Mismatched mugs, a chipped bowl on the drying rack, the magnet with Rosie's chicken soup recipe pinned to the fridge, And yet nothing felt the same. This kitchen had seen versions of me that no longer lived here. The woman who waited for Kyle's calls, who rechecked bank statements out of guilt, who let love be measured in how much she gave up. That woman had been kind, but she'd also been tired. And now I was becoming something else. I opened a new browser tab and clicked on the bookmarked link Coral Bay Sanctuary. Ocean View Retreat. There it was. The villa. Still listed. Still waiting. A one-story cottage perched along a soft coastal ridge just outside a quiet town where no one knew my name. The shutters were painted seafoam green. The balcony wrapped around the back like an embrace. It wasn't luxurious, but it was honest. There was a linen hammock in one of the photos, a wooden desk under a window, a ceramic pitcher filled with lemon blossoms. I had saved the listing months ago, back when it felt like nothing more than a fantasy, a dream you open late at night when the silence gets too loud. But it had lingered, like a lighthouse on a foggy coast. And now, I was ready to follow it. I picked up the phone and called Clara. It's time I said. She didn't ask what I meant. She just said, I'll process the transfer today. You're sure? I've never been more sure. When the call ended, I stood and walked to the closet. Packing was easy. I didn't need much. Just 2 suitcases, one for soft cotton dresses, sandals, a warm cardigan, and the blue scarf my mother left me. The other for the essentials, my leather folder with every legal document now in my name, a photo album with carefully chosen moments. Childhood smiles, my wedding day. A Polaroid of Rosie and me holding teacups at the church fair. And my journal. I paused before zipping the last bag. Then I added my old nurse's pin. Not because I missed the job, but because I never wanted to forget the part of me that had once held others together. Now I would hold myself. Rosie came by just before noon. She didn't bring flowers or ask if I was nervous. She just walked in, like always, handed me a sandwich wrapped in parchment and asked, "You good?" "I'm good," I said. "You want to leave a note?" I shook my head. "There's nothing left to explain." She nodded. "Then let's get you to the ferry." The ride was quiet. Neither of us needed to fill the silence. The town rolled by slowly, familiar and distant all at once. The corner bakery. The post office where I mailed birthday cards that stopped being opened. The bench by the park where I once sat waiting for Kyle's soccer practice to end, long before either of us knew how far apart we'd drift. I didn't cry. I didn't mourn. Some endings arrive as peace, not pain. At the dock, the ferry waited, white and blue gently rocking. Rosie helped me with the bags. Then she hugged me. A real hug, the kind that lets you go without holding back. I boarded alone. The deck was open, the wind cool against my cheeks. I stood by the railing and watched the shoreline grow smaller. I didn't look back. Because what I needed wasn't behind me. It was waiting just ahead. In a little cottage by the sea where no one knew my name and where every breath I took would belong only to me. It didn't take long for the sea to start working on me. Within days of moving into the cottage at Coral Bay, my breathing had changed. I hadn't noticed at first. But one morning, walking barefoot to the edge of the dock, I realized I was no longer holding my breath. Not waiting for a message, not bracing for a call, not calculating someone else's needs before my own. I was just present. The mornings came quietly. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the tide roll in like a conversation I no longer had to respond to. The air smelled faintly of salt and lemon. Gulls called to each other overhead, never waiting for permission. I started visiting the open market every Saturday, not to run errands, just to wander. I'd buy tomatoes that still had dirt on their skin, bread warm from a woman's own oven, and jars of honey so thick you had to spoon them out. People didn't ask who I was. They didn't ask what I had left behind. They just smiled, offered samples, and welcomed me into the ordinary magic of their small, quiet routines. By the second week, I'd memorized the bus schedule, learned the name of the shopkeeper who repaired shoes, and signed up for a Thursday sailing lesson, not because I dreamed of mastering the sea, but because I wanted to feel the wind again in a way that had nothing to do with airports or missed pickups. And every Wednesday afternoon, I walked to the community hall with a manila folder under my arm and a notebook filled with outlines. That's where Freedom Finance for Women began. It was a small room, pale blue walls, a long folding table and 12 chairs that never matched. At first, I wasn't sure anyone would come, but they did. The first week, it was just 3 of us. Marjorie, who had been guilted into draining her annuity for her grandson's business dream. Irene, whose adult daughter still used her credit card for emergencies. And me, a woman with no grand declarations, just lived experience and a clear file of boundaries, learned the hard way. We didn't start with budgets. We started with silence. With the kind of silence that says, you can speak here. You don't owe an apology for wanting to be okay. By the 4th week, we had 12 women. Some cried. Some just nodded. One asked, "Is it wrong to say no when your child is struggling?" And I told her what I had come to believe. No one learns to stand if we never let go of their hand. Helping isn't the same as carrying. And carrying for too long breaks your own spine. I shared how to read a bank statement, how to create a basic trust, how to say the word no without explanation. But more than that, we talked about guilt. How it attaches itself to mothers like Ivy climbing over everything until we forget the shape of our own needs. You were never helpless, I told them every week. Just unheard. Until now. Back in the city, things were shifting too. I hadn't checked on Kyle. I didn't follow him online. But the universe has a way of slipping you information whether you ask or not. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, but the handwriting stopped me cold. It was his, Kyle's. I took it inside, sat at the desk in the bedroom, and stared at it for a while before opening it. 5 pages. No apology, just panic dressed up as explanation. He wrote about frozen cards, about calls from the mortgage office, about missed payments and threats of account reviews. He said things were getting complicated, that people were asking questions, that maybe we could meet, talk, sort things out. But the tone hadn't changed. It was still built on assumption that I would fix it, that I still saw myself as the net beneath his fall. He didn't ask how I was, not once. I read the letter once, slowly. I didn't skim. I let every word land. Then I folded it, slid it into a folder, and labeled it Unsolicited Confession. Potential financial misconduct. I mailed it to the Financial Crimes Investigation Bureau the next morning. No anger, no note, just facts. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt responsible. A few weeks later, I was sitting at a cafe tucked into a bend near the harbor, an old place with wicker chairs and chipped ceramic mugs. The waitress was young, freckled, and always wore pink nail polish that made her hands look like candy. I was sipping green tea when the muted television above the bar flickered to life. Breaking news. Local entrepreneur Kyle Monroe arrested in ongoing fraud investigation. There he was. His mugshot, tired eyes, stiff shoulders. The same expression he had when he was 7 and tried to lie about the broken lamp. I stared for a moment. Not in shock, just in observation. The captions rolled across the bottom of the screen. Multiple counts of embezzlement, misuse of shared accounts, investigations ongoing. No part of me flinched. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't feel vindicated. I just turned my gaze back to the window where 2 boys were flying a homemade kite. It caught the wind and rose sharply, twisting above the shoreline in wide, joyful loops. I took another sip of tea. There had been a time when I would have sold my wedding ring to shield Kyle from that kind of consequence. But that time was gone, and in its place, not resentment, not triumph, just breath, and the knowledge that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them live inside the shape of their own choices. The morning of my 70th birthday arrived without fanfare. No balloons taped to the door. No phone buzzing with cheerful notifications. no one asking what kind of cake I liked, and yet it didn't feel empty. It felt still. I woke slowly, eyes adjusting to the soft light that poured in through the white curtains dancing across the wooden floor of my cottage. The sea whispered in the distance, not crashing, not calling, just there, constant, like breath. I sat up in bed and reached for my robe. The fabric was cool, worn in all the right places. I had bought it months ago on a quiet morning, much like this one, when I realized I could finally choose comfort for myself without asking who might need something first. In the kitchen, I made tea. Jasmine and chamomile with a touch of honey. I poured it into the blue ceramic mug Rosie had gifted me just before I left the city. It had a tiny chip at the rim now, but I liked that. It made the mug feel real, lived in, like me. I didn't open any cards. There weren't any. No texts. No voicemails. But somehow the quiet didn't sting. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt untethered, in the most peaceful way. After breakfast, I changed into a soft linen dress, pale gray with short sleeves and a loose fit that danced around my calves when I walked. I brushed my hair into a low twist, slipped on sandals, and reached for a small cloth pouch that had sat on my dresser for weeks. Inside it was a stone, smooth, round, etched with one word: closure. Rosie had given it to me on the porch of my old house just days before I left. It's not magic, she'd said, but sometimes holding a thing gives your body a chance to catch up with what your heart already knows. Now I tucked that stone into my palm and stepped outside. The walk to the shoreline was familiar by now. The winding path beneath my feet, the low chatter of birds in the hedges, the small bakery on the corner just beginning to open its shutters. The scent of warm bread and salt air mingled as I passed, and someone, an older man sweeping his steps, lifted a hand in greeting. I smiled and nodded. No one here knew it was my birthday. No one needed to. As I reached the edge of the sand, the tide had just begun to rise, brushing over the shore in slow, lazy waves. The sky was a soft blue streaked with hints of rose and gold. I stepped out of my sandals and walked barefoot across the cool sand, letting it cling to my skin. The stone in my hand felt heavier than it should. Maybe it was never the weight of the object itself, but the meaning it carried. I walked until the water touched my ankles, then my shins. The chill made me inhale sharply, but I didn't move back. I let the sea greet me. In that moment, I thought about the version of me who once stood alone at an airport curb waiting for a son who never came. I thought about the woman who opened credit card statements with her stomach in knots. The one who sat quietly in court while lies were spun into legal language. The mother, the widow, the caretaker, the woman who kept shrinking herself to fit inside everyone else's plans. But I didn't cry. I didn't ache. Instead, I said, quietly aloud, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but to every part of me that had kept going, that had bent without breaking. I took the stone and curled my fingers around it one last time. Then I pulled back my arm and threw it. It sailed through the morning light, spinning once, twice, then vanished into the sea without a sound. I didn't wait for the splash. I didn't trace the ripples. I just stood there as the water wrapped around my legs and let myself be held. Not by anyone else, but by the moment. Later that day, I walked to the Coral Bay town office to sign my residency papers. The clerk behind the desk had kind eyes and wore a sweater with a small embroidered lighthouse on the sleeve. He took my documents, flipped through them quickly, then asked, "Name to print on the mailbox." I hesitated for only a breath, then said Elaine Monroe. Just that. No family name attached. No hyphenated past. No trailing history. He smiled and nodded. "Welcome home, Ms. Monroe." I returned to the cottage in time to catch the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the garden wall. The bougainvillea had begun to bloom. Bright, stubborn, joyful. That evening I poured myself a small glass of red wine and carried my journal out to the balcony. The sea was calm, lavender-tinted beneath a slow-setting sun. The sky folded into itself in quiet celebration. I opened the last page of the journal, the one I had saved. And I wrote in even, steady strokes, "Today I belong only to myself." I underlined it twice, not for emphasis, for permanence. I closed the book, placed it beside the empty mug, and sat with the night as it gathered gently around me. There were no ghosts here, no echoes of should-have-beens, no whispered regrets, only breath, only sea, only me. And for the first time in 70 years, I didn't feel like someone who had been left behind. I felt like someone who had chosen to walk away and never looked back. If you've ever given too much of yourself, quietly without applause, just to be left standing in the cold, I hope Elaine's story made you feel seen. Have you ever had to choose peace over proximity to love someone from a distance, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring for yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read every word, because this channel is for women like you. Women who've carried generations, who've stayed silent to keep the peace, and who are just now beginning to speak for themselves. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell. There are more stories coming. Stories of quiet strength, of boundaries reclaimed, and of mothers who decided to write the ending in their own voice. Because you were never weak. You were just waiting for the moment you'd be heard. And maybe that moment is now.